An ordinary woman received divine signs no one believed. Mysterious messages, impossible coincidences, and inexplicable phenomena guided her on a journey that revealed secrets buried for decades. When the proof emerged, even the most skeptical fell to their knees in prayer. A true story of faith, redemption, and miracles that will change your perspective on divine intervention. Prepare to question everything you believe. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching this extraordinary revelation from. In the quiet of the morning, while the mist still hugged the Appalachian Mountains, Helen Miller opened her eyes even before the alarm clock announced the start of another day. For 20 years, her routine had been as predictable as the seasons in that small town of St. Benedict's Valley, a place where time seemed to move to the rhythm of novenas and harvests. At 35, Helen carried the reputation of being the voice of reason in a community where miracles were everyday conversation topics. What she didn't know, as she pushed aside the flowered sheets her mother had embroidered before she passed away, was that this Wednesday would forever change the course of her meticulously planned existence. It was on the bathroom mirror, fogged by the steam from the shower, that the words appeared, as if written by an invisible finger on the damp surface. "Help the lost daughter. 28 days. Helen blinked several times, rubbed her eyes, and adjusted the simple framed glasses she had worn since college. It must be a trick of the morning light, she thought, or perhaps some remnant of a dream still lingering in her mind. After all, who would have entered her small townhouse on Flower Street to leave such a message? With a quick motion, she wiped the words away with the yellow towel and headed for breakfast. Rationality had always been her most faithful companion. "Nonsense," she muttered to herself as she tucked her cotton blouse into the navy blue skirt that was part of her unofficial teacher's uniform. She walked along the town's cobblestone streets, greeting the shopkeepers opening their stores and the ladies already shaking their dusters on the porches of the colorful houses. The bell of St. Benedict's main church chimed 7 times, as it had for over 100 years, marking the rhythm of local life. "Good morning, Miss Miller. Sleep well?" asked Mrs. Carmen, the florist, whose time-wrinkled hands were preparing arrangements for the day's novena. "As always, Mrs. Carmen," Helen replied, avoiding mention of the strange message she was trying to erase from her thoughts. The public school occupied an old colonial-era mansion, its thick walls keeping it cool even on the hottest days. As she walked through the hallways, Helen heard the chatter of students who affectionately called her Miss Science, a nickname she had proudly carried since she began teaching that not everything seemingly magical needed supernatural explanations. "God save us from the skeptics," Father Anthony would always say jokingly, when he met her after the Mass she attended more out of tradition than conviction. It was during the lesson on the water cycle that Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. While explaining evaporation, she vividly remembered the words on the mirror. For a moment, she lost her train of thought, which rarely happened. "Teacher, are you okay?" asked Petey, a boy with curious eyes who always sat in the front row. "I'm fine, dear. Just got distracted by a raindrop on the window," she lied, pointing to the sky which, curiously, was beginning to darken despite the forecast predicting sun all week. When the bell announced the end of the school day, a light rain was falling over St. Benedict's. Helen declined a ride offered by Clarice, the history teacher, preferring to walk under the black umbrella she always carried in her bag. She needed to organize her thoughts, shake off the uneasy feeling that had followed her all day. The rain intensified as she turned onto her street. Fat drops drummed on her umbrella like impatient fingers. For some inexplicable reason, her heart quickened as she put the key in the lock. The house was exactly as she had left it that morning. Books organized by subject on the dark wood shelves, meticulously cared-for plants, photographs in polished silver frames. Everything in its place except for one detail that made her bag slip from her shoulder and fall to the wooden floor with a dull thud. On the white living room wall, water droplets were slowly forming and arranging themselves into letters like, "Do manifesting out of nowhere, help the lost daughter, 28 days." And as Helen watched, paralyzed, the words began to evaporate, disappearing little by little, as if they had never existed. "This can't be happening," she whispered to herself, closing her eyes tightly and counting to 10, as she had done since childhood when something scared her. But when she opened them, a single drop remained, slowly trickling down the wall like a solitary tear. Have you ever felt like the universe is trying to tell you something? That forces beyond our understanding choose unlikely instruments for their designs. Helen had never believed in such things. For every mystery, there was a scientific explanation waiting to be discovered. For every miracle, a misunderstood natural phenomenon. But how to explain the inexplicable without sounding like someone who had lost their mind? The following days brought more events that challenged the Cartesian logic Helen clung to like a castaway to a piece of wood. On Thursday, all the clocks in her house stopped simultaneously at 3:33 p.m. On Friday, while teaching the 5th grade about bird migration, a flock of birds formed a pattern in the sky that distinctly resembled the outline of a child. On Saturday, while organizing old family photographs, Helen found something that made her blood run cold. In an album she had flipped through hundreds of times, there was now a photo she had never seen before. Between her and her mother, at the traditional school's summer fair 15 years ago, appeared an unknown girl, about 12 years old, looking directly at the camera with a sad smile and eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. The girl held a little red ribbon in her hands, the kind the faithful tie on their wrists after making promises. On the edges of the photograph, dark smudges seemed to move when Helen wasn't looking directly at them. It was that night that Helen decided she couldn't keep this secret any longer. After the lonely dinner she had prepared with no appetite, she dialed the number of Teresa, the town pharmacist, and the only friend she trusted completely. "I need to show you something, but promise you won't think I'm crazy," she said as soon as her friend answered. "I promise, but only if you promise. You're not involved with that geography teacher from the state school. My cousin said she saw him buying rings in Denver last month," Teresa replied, trying to coax a smile from her friend. "No romance this time, Teresa. It's something different. Can you come over now?" An hour later, the two women were sitting at Helen's kitchen table. Laid out on the wooden surface were the photo album, a notebook with notes about the strange occurrences, and the miraculous medal Helen had found that morning, partially buried in the small garden she kept behind the D. "And you've never seen this girl before?" Teresa asked, examining the photograph carefully. "Never. And I know every child who has passed through the school in the last 20 years. Besides, this photo was taken in 2009. I remember this day perfectly because it was when my mother had the first symptom of the illness that later took her." Teresa turned the small medal between her fingers. On the back, a date was engraved. 5/03/1997. 27 years ago, Teresa murmured. Her brown eyes, always sharp behind thin-rimmed glasses, met Helen's. "Do you know what happened on this date?" Helen shook her head. It was then that Teresa revealed something that would make the pieces start to fit together. That was when a baby was left on the church steps. Everyone talked about it, but then the talk died down. Father Jerome, who came before Father Anthony, arranged for the child to be sent for adoption in Denver. I remember because my mother was part of the ladies' group that helped at the parish. The night wind rustled the kitchen window curtains, carrying the scent of damp earth and jasmine flowers. For a moment, the two women sat in silence, as if the weight of this revelation needed space to settle. "Teresa, do you believe in signs?" Helen finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. Teresa adjusted her glasses and brought her teacup to her lips before answering. "I was adopted, Helen. I never told you this, but when I turned 18, I started dreaming about a yellow house with blue windows. The dream was so recurrent that I decided to look for my biological parents. Do you know where my mother lived when she had me? In a yellow house with blue windows in Santa Fe." Helen's eyes widened. In all their years of friendship, Teresa had never shared this story. "Some things can't be explained by science, my friend," Teresa continued, "and some coincidences are too coincidental to be just that." The next morning, a sunny Sunday, Helen went to the main church, not to attend Mass, which had already ended, but to speak with Father Anthony. The priest, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and a kind smile, received her in the small room attached to the sacristy. "How can I help you, Miss Miller?" he asked, offering her a dark wooden chair, a relic from colonial times. "Father, I need information about a baby who was left on the steps of this church 27 years ago," Helen said, getting straight to the point. The priest's smile vanished instantly. His eyes, previously warm, became cautious. "Why would you be interested in something that happened so long ago?" Helen hesitated. How could she explain to the priest about mysterious messages on mirrors and walls, about photographs appearing out of nowhere, and birds forming impossible patterns in the sky? "I'm conducting some historical research about the town," she lied, nervously adjusting her glasses. The priest watched her in silence for an overly long moment. Then, as if having made a difficult decision, he rose from his chair and walked to a shelf filled with old books. "The parish records are confidential, Miss Miller, but I can tell you that, yes, there was a child left here in the early hours of May 3, 1997, a newborn girl. To protect the families involved, Father Jerome arranged for her to be sent for adoption in the state capital. That's all I know and all I can tell you." But his eyes said more. They said there were secrets buried deep within that small town, secrets that many preferred to keep hidden, like ancient roots supporting centuries-old trees, invisible yet fundamental to the structure of everything. Leaving the church, Helen felt the weight of the stares from the faithful gathered in the square after Mass. Among them, Mrs. Clotilde, the mayor's older sister and organizer of the annual church bazaar, watched her with an expression that mixed curiosity and concern. "Miss Miller," the lady called, approaching with slow steps, leaning on a carved wooden cane. "I hear you've been asking questions about old town stories." The central square, with its local stone fountain and trees that had witnessed generations, suddenly seemed to fall silent. The running children, the popcorn vendors, the men playing checkers under the shade of the oak trees. Everyone seemed to have paused their activities to listen to this conversation. "Just historical curiosity, Mrs. Clotilde," Helen replied, trying to sound casual. The lady, whose moral rigidity was as well known as the quality of her pumpkin sweets, leaned slightly closer. "There are things, my dear, that should remain buried for the good of the community. Not every truth needs to come to light. Some wounds heal better when left alone." It was a warning disguised as advice. Helen felt a chill run down her spine, but maintained the composure that had earned her respect among students and parents. "I believe truth has its own value, Mrs. Clotilde, and that knowledge frees us more than it imprisons us." The old woman smiled, but her eyes remained serious as the sky before a storm. "Be careful, teacher. The path of reason doesn't always lead to peace. Sometimes mystery is a protective cloak." With these enigmatic words, Mrs. Clotilde moved away, the soft tap of her cane marking the rhythm of her steps on the stone pavement. Helen stood motionless, feeling she had just received not only a warning, but also a kind of confirmation that her questions touched sensitive nerves in the social fabric of St. Benedict's Valley. The following days brought more signs, increasingly specific. On the 10th day after the first message, during the traditional school's summer fair, a peculiar event occurred that would launch Helen on a journey of no return. The fourth graders' square dance had just finished its performance in the courtyard, decorated with colorful little flags and paper lanterns. The smell of popcorn and mulled cider, non-alcoholic, as Principal Margaret made sure to emphasize, filled the air. Helen, in charge of the message delivery booth, was organizing the notes written by the students when a man she had never seen before approached. "Are you Miss Helen Miller?" asked the stranger, a middle-aged man wearing a worn suit that seemed 2 sizes too big for his thin frame. "Yes, I am," she replied, intrigued. Without another word, the man handed her a yellowish envelope and turned to leave. Helen's instinct was faster than her reason. She grabbed the stranger's arm. "Who are you? Who sent this?" The man looked at her hand on his arm and then directly into her eyes. There was something unsettling in his gaze, not threatening, but profoundly disturbing, as if he could see right through her. "I'm just a messenger, teacher, as you are too." And then, with surprising skill for someone so frail-looking, he pulled free from her grasp and disappeared into the crowd of parents and students. Under the flickering light of the bonfires, Helen opened the envelope. Inside, she found a partially burned birth certificate. The child's name was Louise Smith, born on May 3, 1997. The document indicated she now lived in Denver. On the back of the certificate, written in the same handwriting as the messages on the mirror and the wall, was an address in the capital and a sentence: "Time is running out. The lost daughter needs to come home." Like raindrops merging on a window pane, the strange events began to form a recognizable pattern. Helen felt like an instrument in a symphony, whose composer remained hidden, but whose melody was becoming increasingly clear. The next afternoon, Principal Margaret called Helen for a chat in her office. The old air conditioner hummed, struggling against the June heat coming through the frosted glass windows. "Helen, I'm worried about you," said the principal, a stout woman who had run the school for over 2 decades. "Parents are saying you seem distracted in class. Miss Clarice told me she saw you talking to yourself in the science lab. And now this business of investigating a child abandonment that happened before you even graduated." Helen felt her face flush. Her professional reputation, built with such care, was being questioned. "I'm just tired, Margaret. End of semester grading papers, you know how it is." The principal sighed, taking off her glasses to clean them with an embroidered handkerchief. "Why don't you take a few days off? Rest, travel, clear your head. The substitute can take over your classes until the summer break." It wasn't a request, Helen realized. It was guidance disguised as a suggestion. How could she refuse without seeming even more unbalanced in the eyes of the school community? "Maybe you're right," she finally conceded. On her way home, she stopped at Teresa's pharmacy. Her friend greeted her with a warm smile that turned to concern upon noticing her downcast expression. What happened? In a few words, Helen recounted the conversation with the principal and showed the birth certificate she had received. Teresa examined the document with professional attention, as if searching for some hidden active ingredient. "This is incredible. Helen, it's such a clear sign," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with almost childlike excitement. "You need to go to Denver to find this young woman, and I'm going with you. Do you really believe there's something divine in these events?" Helen asked, still torn between her skeptical nature and the growing mountain of inexplicable evidence. Teresa carefully placed the certificate back in the envelope and handed it to her friend. "What I believe, Helen, is that there are things in this world that can't be explained by a microscope or the periodic table. Call it what you want. God, the universe, fate. The name doesn't matter as much as the fact that you were chosen for this mission. And if you refuse the call, well, who knows what consequences that might have." The trip to Denver was scheduled. For the next day, Helen packed only the essentials in a small carry-on bag: a few changes of clothes, her personal documents, the miraculous medal, the mysterious photograph, and the partially burned birth certificate. Before leaving, she looked longingly at the bathroom mirror, almost expecting a new message to appear. But the surface reflected only her pale, tired face, marked by sleepless nights and the restlessness consuming her. "I hope you know what you're doing," she murmured to her reflection. The state capitol welcomed the two friends with the typical chaos of large urban centers: impatient horns, rushing crowds, buildings that seemed to touch the gray sky. A world completely different from quiet St. Benedict's Valley, where the loudest noise came from the church bell and the cicadas in the summer. The address on the back of the certificate led them to a modern apartment building in the Greenwich Village area. On the intercom, a young female voice answered the call. "Good morning, my name is Helen Miller from St. Benedict's Valley. I need to speak with Louise Smith." There was a moment of silence, and then, St. Benedict's Valley, the town with the yellow church on the main square? Helen and Teresa exchanged surprised glances. "Yes, exactly," Helen replied. "Please come. Up, apartment 507. The elevator felt like a time capsule, transporting them to an encounter with the unknown. On the 5th floor, the door to apartment 507 was already ajar when they arrived. A young woman of 27, with dark hair tied in a messy bun and piercing green eyes, waited in the hallway. "You must be Helen," the young woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Louise. Please come in." The apartment was a bright, organized space, decorated with evident artistic taste. On the walls, abstract paintings alternated with landscape photographs. On a table in the corner of the living room, an open laptop displayed what looked like a graphic design project in progress. "I'm a designer," Louise explained, noticing Helen's gaze, "specializing in visual identity for small businesses." Three sat on the living room sofas. Teresa, always practical, got straight to the point. "How do you know St. Benedict's Valley, Louise?" The young woman smiled, a smile that mixed nostalgia and mystery. "I'm going to sound crazy, but I've been dreaming about this town for as long as I can remember. The yellow church, the square with the stone fountain, the surrounding mountains." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. 3 months ago, I found out I was adopted. My parents had never told me, but when my mother passed away in March, I found including this. Louise stood up and went to a small chest of drawers. From a drawer, she pulled out an envelope similar to the one Helen carried. Inside was the other half of the birth certificate, the part missing from the burned document. "I've been researching my origins ever since. All clues point to St. Benedict's Valley. Actually," Louise hesitated again, as if afraid of sounding irrational, "I was already planning to visit the town next week." It was as if lightning struck Helen, a coincidence so improbable it defied any statistical calculation. "Do you believe in signs, Louise?" she asked, repeating the same question she had asked Teresa days before. "After what I've been through these past few months?" The young woman laughed, a crystalline sound that filled the apartment. "I believe there are forces we don't fully understand, and that sometimes these forces push us in directions we need to go." The next few hours were filled with surprising discoveries. Louise and Helen shared the same rare blood type, O negative. Both had a small crescent-shaped birthmark behind their right ear. And to Teresa's complete astonishment, they both shared the same birthday, December 8th, the feast of the Immaculate Conception. "This goes beyond coincidence," Teresa murmured, observing the two women side by side. There were subtle similarities in their gestures, the way they tilted their heads when listening, the rhythm of their speech. Late in the afternoon, as the sun hid behind the city buildings, a decision was made. Louise would accompany Helen and Teresa back to St. Benedict's Valley the next morning. The night was long for Helen. Staying in a simple hotel near the bus station, she tossed and turned in the uncomfortable bed, her mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. What would happen when she brought Louise back to the town? Who really was the lost daughter mentioned in the messages? And why had she, Helen, a science teacher who had always sought rational explanations for everything, been chosen as the instrument for this reunion? When she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of the church in St. Benedict's. But in the dream, the church was enveloped in a strange bluish halo, and in the churchyard, a woman with an indistinct face held a small bundle in her arms that emitted its own light, like a fallen star. The bus that took them back to the small town departed at 7 a.m. During the 4-hour journey, Louise talked about her life, raised by loving parents in Denver, graduated with a degree in graphic design, and built a promising career. She had never lacked anything, except for an inexplicable feeling of displacement, as if part of her belonged elsewhere. "When I found out I was adopted, a lot of things started to make sense," she explained, as the bus wound through the mountain roads. The recurring dreams of a place I'd never visited, my inexplicable affinity for stories of abandoned children, even my medical condition. "Medical condition?" asked Teresa, sitting next to Helen. Louise nodded. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with an extremely rare autoimmune disease. The doctor said it affects only 1 in 100,000 people. I went through an experimental treatment, and thankfully, I'm in remission." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. Another piece of the cosmic puzzle seemed to be forming before her eyes. When the bus finally crossed the welcome sign for St. Benedict's Valley, the previously clear sky began to darken. Dense clouds gathered over the small town, promising a storm. The driver commented that it was strange, as the forecast had indicated sun all day. At the small bus station, a few people waited for the bus to arrive. Among them, to Helen's surprise, was Father Anthony, his eyes immediately fixed on Louise, as she stepped off the bus as if recognizing something familiar in this stranger. "Miss Miller," the priest greeted, without taking his eyes off the young woman. "I see you've brought a visitor to our town." "Father Anthony, this is Louise Smith from Denver," Helen introduced, carefully observing the priest's reaction. Something indescribable crossed the priest's wrinkled face, a mixture of recognition, astonishment, and perhaps a touch of reverential fear. "Welcome to St. Benedict's Valley, my child," he said, his voice slightly trembling. "It seems you've chosen an interesting day to visit. We'll have the procession in honor of our patron saint this afternoon." As if orchestrated by the heavens, thunder rumbled in the distance, making everyone instinctively look up. The clouds now formed unusual circular patterns, like suspended whirlpools. "Strange weather," Teresa commented. "It seems the heavens know something important is happening." The priest gave her a piercing look, as if those words carried more truth than the pharmacist could imagine. "The heavens always know, my child. Always." The town received the newcomer with the curiosity typical of small communities. As they walked down the main street towards Helen's house, faces appeared in windows. Shopkeepers paused their activities to watch, and whispers followed their steps. Faithful shadows. "It's exactly like in my dreams," Louise murmured, amazed. Her eyes absorbed every detail: the colorful houses with their wrought iron balconies, the cobblestone alleys, the pots of ferns hanging on the porches, the smell of fresh bread coming from Old Man Joe's bakery. They arrived at Helen's house just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Large and heavy, they made a metallic sound hitting the tin roofs. "Can we join the procession?" Louise asked, while helping Helen make coffee. "Are you sure?" "It's going to rain hard," Helen replied, looking worriedly at the increasingly dark sky through the kitchen window. "I'm sure. I feel like I need to be there." And so, 3 hours later, Helen, Teresa, and Louise joined the crowd gathering in the central square. The rain had momentarily stopped, but the air remained charged with electricity. The statue of St. Benedict, normally kept at the side altar of the church, now rested on a processional litter decorated with white flowers and golden ribbons. Father Anthony, robed in his ceremonial vestments, began the prayers. His voice, amplified by a small sound system, echoed through the narrow streets. "Saint Benedict the Moor, son of slaves who became a saint, teach us that God chooses the humble to confound the wise and powerful of this world." It was then that it happened. As the procession began to move, winding through the town streets, Louise stopped suddenly as they passed a white 2-story house with blue windows and a small, well-kept garden. "This house," she whispered, her face pale as wax. "I know it. I've been here before." Helen held her arm, worried the young woman might faint. "That's Dr. Matthews' old house," Teresa explained. "The town doctor for over 30 years. He passed away 5 years ago, but his wife, Mrs. Eulalia, still lives there." As if summoned by her words, an elderly lady appeared on the porch, drawn by the sound of the procession. Her eyes, still vivid, in a face marked by time, fixed on Louise with disturbing intensity. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two women, separated by generations, stared at each other across the distance. And then, without warning, Mrs. Eulalia turned pale, clutched her chest, and collapsed. The confusion was immediate. The procession halted. People ran to help the elderly woman. Alarmed voices rose like a swarm of frightened bees. Amidst the chaos, no one noticed when the sky suddenly opened up in a torrential downpour, except for a single drop that fell directly onto Louise's forehead, running down her face like a cosmic tear. Have you ever felt like you're part of something bigger than yourself? That your personal story is just one chapter in a much larger book written by invisible hands? As the local doctor attended to Mrs. Eulalia, who had been carried inside her house, Helen watched Louise standing in the rain, her face lifted to the sky as if receiving a blessing or a revelation. The 15th day since the first message brought a discovery that would change everything. While Mrs. Eulalia recovered from what was diagnosed as a simple faint due to strong emotion, Teresa did some detective work in the old files of the pharmacy she had inherited from her father. I found something, she told Helen over the phone, her voice vibrating with excitement. Records of purchases made by Dr. Matthews in May 1997. Specific medications for newborns, prenatal vitamins, antibiotics, all dated a few days before and after Louise's birth. But Mrs. Eulalia never had children, Helen replied, looking at Louise sleeping on her living room sofa, exhausted after the intense emotional experience of the previous day. Exactly. Teresa's voice was almost a conspiratorial whisper. And there's more. An incredible storm broke over Dr. Matthews' house just now. Lightning struck the roof directly, damaging part of the structure. The firefighters were called to check the damage and they found something in the attic, an old box hidden among the beams. Helen felt her heart race. What was in the box? I don't know yet. But Mrs. Carmen, who's helping Mrs. Eulalia, called me saying the old lady is panicking, begging for no one to open. That box says it contains memories that should remain buried. When Helen hung up the phone, she noticed Louise had woken up and was watching her intently. They found something important, didn't they? The young woman asked. I can feel it. It's like every cell in my body has been vibrating at a different frequency since I arrived in this town. Helen nodded slowly. I think we're very close to discovering the truth about your birth, Louise. But are you sure you want to go on? Some truths can be painful. The young woman got up from the sofa and walked to the window. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but now softly, almost musically, like gentle fingers tapping on the roofs. All my life I felt there was an emptiness inside me, a space that nothing seemed to fill completely. Now I know why. She turned to face Helen, her green eyes shining with determination. I need to know who I am, where I came from, why I was left at that church, even if it hurts, even if it changes everything I've always believed about myself. That night, as the storm finally subsided, leaving the air clean and fresh, an impromptu meeting took place at Teresa's pharmacy. Helen and Louise arrived discreetly through the back, avoiding the curious glances of the townspeople. To their surprise, Father Anthony was already there, sitting in a wooden chair in the small office at the back of the shop. On Teresa's desk lay the box found in the attic of Dr. Matthews' house, a cedar box with delicate carvings and a small brass lock, now broken open by the impact when part of the roof collapsed. I shouldn't be here, the priest said, his face a mask of concern. But I feel that God is working in mysterious ways these days, and who am I to question his designs? Teresa ceremoniously opened the box. Inside, carefully arranged, were an album of photographs showing Mrs. Eulalia visibly pregnant, contradicting the official story that she could never have children. A bundle of letters yellowed with time, exchanged between Dr. Matthews and a certain Cecilia, whom Teresa identified as the niece of the former mayor who had supposedly gone to study in Europe after finishing high school, but who had actually never left the US. An envelope containing a lock of auburn hair, identical to Louise's hair color, and at the bottom of the box, a diary in the doctor's impeccable handwriting, recounting the events of that turbulent period. With trembling hands, Father Anthony picked up the diary and read some passages aloud. The story that emerged was one of a forbidden love between Cecilia, the former mayor's niece, and her piano teacher, a married man. The resulting pregnancy, in a deeply religious and conservative community, represented an unbearable scandal. Dr. Matthews and his wife, close family friends, offered a solution. Cecilia would spend her pregnancy secluded in their home, away from the town's prying eyes. After the birth, the child would be given up for adoption, and Cecilia would leave to study in Europe. Actually, for a stay in a rest home in Chicago, to recover from the trauma. That's why Mrs. Eulalia fainted. When she saw you, the priest explained, looking at Louise with teary eyes. You are the living image of Cecilia at 27. Louise, who had listened to the whole story in silence, finally let tears flow freely down her face. So my biological mother is alive? "Where is she now?" It was Teresa who answered. Cecilia returned to the area a few years ago, after her uncle's death. She lives secluded on a small farm on the outskirts of town. Few people see her. They say she suffers from an illness that has left her debilitated. Helen, watching Louise closely, noticed how the young woman paled upon hearing this information. "What kind of illness?" Louise asked, her voice barely a whisper. Teresa hesitated, glancing briefly at the priest, who nodded silently. "A rare autoimmune disease, the same one you had, Louise." The 20th day since the first mysterious message dawned clear, as if the previous day's storm had washed not only the cobblestone streets, but also the souls of the inhabitants of St. Benedict's Valley. It was the day of the traditional blessing of the waters, a ritual where the priest blessed the fountain in the central square, considered miraculous by many. The entire town gathered for this event, including those who rarely attended church. Helen, Teresa, and Louise positioned themselves discreetly on the side of the square, watching the crowd milling around the old local stone fountain. Father Anthony, dressed in his most solemn vestments, conducted the ceremony with serene dignity. His elderly hands sprinkled holy water onto the fountain, as his voice intoned blessings in Latin, connecting this small ritual to an ancient tradition. "Now, as is our custom, I invite everyone to approach and touch the blessed waters." The priest announced into the microphone, "May the grace of St. Benedict and the blessing of our Lord Jesus Christ descend upon you through these purifying waters." The line formed quickly. Children, elderly people, shopkeepers, farmers, the full diversity of that small society paraded before the fountain, wetting their hands and making the sign of the cross. "You should go too," Helen whispered to Louise. The young woman hesitated. "I don't know, I feel like everyone is looking at me like I'm an intruder." "Go," Teresa insisted, gently nudging her towards the line. "Something tells me you need to be part of this ritual." Reluctantly, Louise joined the line. When it was finally her turn, she timidly reached out her hand to touch the crystal-clear water. At the exact moment her fingers broke the liquid surface, something extraordinary happened. The water in the fountain took on a soft pinkish hue, as if someone had poured a few drops of wine into it. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. Father Anthony, watching closely, let out a gasp of surprise. Several people pulled out their phones to record the inexplicable phenomenon. "It's a sign!" exclaimed Mrs. Carmen, the florist. "A sign from God." Louise stepped back, frightened by her own ability to cause such a phenomenon. Helen rushed to support her, fearing the young woman might be overwhelmed by the crowd's reaction. But, to her surprise, the faces around showed no fear or revulsion, only reverent awe, as if witnessing something sacred. "The water will return to normal in a few minutes," the priest declared with surprising calm. "This isn't the first time our fountain has shown extraordinary signs. In 1879, during a great drought, its waters acquired a golden glow on the eve of the saving rain's arrival." With these words, the priest effectively transformed what could have been seen as a frightening event into something that fit the local tradition, one miracle among many that formed the rich tapestry of stories in that community. Later, in the church sacristy, Father Anthony met with Helen, Teresa, and Louise. His face, usually serene, showed signs of deep disturbance. "What happened today was no coincidence," he said, carefully closing the door to ensure privacy. "Just as Louise's arrival right now is no coincidence, when Cecilia is facing the final stages of her illness." "Final stages?" Louise paled. "Is she?" The priest nodded gravely. "The doctors have given her only a few months to live unless—" He hesitated, as if weighing each word. "Unless she receives a bone marrow transplant. Unfortunately, her type is extremely rare, and no compatible donor has been found so far." Helen felt the impact of the revelation like a physical blow. Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place with crystal clarity. "That's why we received the signs," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. The 28 days. The deadline wasn't just to find Louise. It was the time needed to perform the procedure before it was too late. Teresa, always practical, was already calculating. If today is the 20th day, We have only 8 days for compatibility tests, preparation, and the procedure. It's possible, but we need to act quickly." Louise, who had remained silent absorbing all this information, finally spoke. "I want to meet her, even if there isn't time to." Her voice broke. "Even if it's just to say goodbye." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Medical tests confirmed what they already suspected. Louise was a perfect donor for Cecilia. The two shared not only the same rare genetic markers, but also the same specific mutation that made their medical condition so unique. The news of Cecilia's possible cure and the extraordinary reunion between mother and daughter separated for 27 years spread through the town like wildfire. The community, initially divided between the desire to preserve past secrets and the hope represented by this reunion, gradually leaned towards reconciliation. Mrs. Clotilde, the mayor's sister who had warned Helen not to dig up old stories, personally led a campaign to raise funds for the medical treatment. The town's traditional prayer women organized a continuous prayer chain, taking turns day and night in the church's side chapel. On the 27th day, something extraordinary happened in the small garden behind Helen's house. Among the rosemary and basil plants, a flower bloomed that no one in town had ever seen, with translucent petals that caught the sunlight and refracted it into impossible colors, like a living prism. Old Man Jerome, the town's oldest gardener, was called to identify it. The man, whose calloused hands had tilled the earth for over 70 years, knelt with difficulty before the mysterious plant. "It's the golden rose of Jericho," he declared reverently. "It blooms only once every 27 years, and only under very special circumstances. My grandfather told me about it, but I never thought I'd live to see one." And so, on the 28th day, exactly at 3:33 p.m., the time all the clocks in Helen's house had stopped in the second week of this extraordinary journey, 2 cars arrived simultaneously at the church square of St. Benedict's. From one, Louise emerged, accompanied by Helen and Teresa. From the other, supported by a nurse, emerged a middle-aged woman whose prematurely white hair and illness-marked face couldn't hide the beauty that had once enchanted a piano teacher. Mother and daughter, separated by 27 years of secrets and social conventions, finally met under the compassionate gaze of the statue of Saint Benedict. No words were needed. Their bodies knew, on a cellular level, that they belonged to each other. When they embraced, something inexplicable happened. A halo of soft light like a miniature dawn enveloped the two women. Those present, and by then, much of the town had gathered to witness the encounter, held their breath collectively. Phones were raised to capture the moment, but curiously, in the photographs later developed, the halo appeared even more intense and defined than it did to the naked eye. For Helen, watching the scene with tears in her eyes, a certainty crystallized. In her heart, she had been an instrument of something much larger than herself. Something some would call fate, others divine providence, and still others simple cosmic coincidence. The medical procedure was performed that same night, initiating the healing process that doctors would later describe as remarkably successful and bordering on the miraculous in their clinical reports. In the months that followed, life in St. Benedict's Valley subtly transformed. Old gossip and judgments gave way to a new understanding of human fragility and the importance of forgiveness. The story of Cecilia and Louise, now openly told, albeit with the respect it deserved, became part of the rich local folklore, a parable about redemption and second chances. Helen returned to her science classes, but something had changed in her approach. While still teaching about molecules, cells, and the laws of physics, she now found room in her explanations for mystery and wonder, for those questions that science still couldn't answer, and perhaps never fully could. One autumn afternoon, almost a year after the first sign on the bathroom mirror, Helen met Teresa in the central square. They sat together on a wooden bench, watching Louise and Cecilia, now recovered, choosing flowers at Mrs. Carmen's stall. "Do you still have the miraculous medal?" Teresa asked as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and red. Helen smiled, taking the small golden medal she had found in her garden at the beginning of that extraordinary journey from her pocket. "Always with me," she replied. "And do you still believe it was all just a series of coincidences?" Teresa teased gently, knowing her friend's skeptical nature well. Helen watched for a moment as the setting sunlight reflected off the medal, creating tiny rainbows on its surface. "Let's just say I've learned the world is broader and more wonderful than my science books ever suggested," she finally answered. "And that sometimes we need to believe before we see, not the other way around." The two friends remained in comfortable silence, witnesses to a miracle that had transformed not just two lives, but an entire community. Above them, the last rays of sun illuminated the church bell tower where, almost 3 decades earlier, a newborn baby had been left, not by chance, but as part of a much larger plan whose full beauty was only now being revealed. And you, who have followed this story to the end, might wonder if there's a greater purpose behind the coincidences in your own life. If there are messages written on fogged mirrors you haven't noticed yet, or subtle signs awaiting your awakening. For miracles, as Helen discovered, don't require grand gestures or dramatic manifestations. Sometimes they reveal themselves in the simple reunion of long-separated hearts, in the healing of old wounds, or in the courage to look beyond the veil of the everyday to see the extraordinary that was always there, patiently waiting to be recognized.